When my manager said, "You should be grateful we even keep you here. Most companies wouldn't touch someone with your level of performance." The entire meeting room went quiet. I remember the exact sound of the air conditioner humming above us, the smell of burnt coffee from the machine in the hallway, the way my fingers tightened around my phone under the table. 17 minutes earlier, I had signed an employment contract. Senior Director of Engineering. Base salary, $310,000. Stock options estimated at $1. $8 million over 4 years. A signing bonus bigger than my annual rent. And the man humiliating me in front of the entire department had no idea. I looked at him across the conference table. Daniel Mercer. 48 years old. Expensive navy suit. Perfect haircut. The kind of smile people mistake for confidence until they work under him long enough to recognize cruelty. Around us, everyone stared at their laptops. Nobody wanted to make eye contact. Nobody wanted to become the next target. I slowly placed my phone face down on the table and smiled. "You're right," I said calmly. "I actually am very lucky." The relief on Daniel's face was immediate. He thought I had accepted it. Accepted him. Accepted the role he had spent years forcing me into. Small. Replaceable. Controlled. But the truth was that something inside me had already detached from that room. Maybe it happened when I signed the offer letter. Maybe it happened months earlier. The first time I realized Daniel wasn't trying to develop me anymore, he was trying to contain me. Or maybe it happened after years of exhaustion, anxiety, and convincing myself that if I just worked harder, eventually he would treat me fairly. I had worked at Brightstone Systems for almost 6 years. When I joined the company in 2019, I thought I had won the lottery. Brightstone was one of the fastest-growing enterprise software firms in Chicago. They built logistics platforms for healthcare companies, shipping networks, and retail chains. At the time, they had around 300 employees and were expanding aggressively. I had graduated from the University of Illinois with a degree in software engineering, and exactly $41 left in my bank account after paying my first month of rent. The company hired me as a junior back-end engineer at $72,000 a year. To me, that sounded like unimaginable money. Back then, Daniel Mercer seemed inspiring. During my interview, he spoke passionately about innovation, ownership, and building scalable systems. "We reward people who solve hard problems," he had told me. "If you perform well here, your career will move very fast." First, he was right. My first 2 years at Brightstone were the best period of my professional life. I worked obsessively. Not because anyone forced me to, because I genuinely loved engineering. I rebuilt part of a hospital inventory system that reduced synchronization failures by nearly 90%. I designed an internal monitoring framework that cut downtime alerts from 20 minutes to under 90 seconds. One client specifically requested that I stay assigned to their account because they trusted my work more than anyone else on the team. Daniel praised me constantly. He called me one of the strongest young engineers in the department. During meetings, he would point to my projects as examples of good architecture. At the end of my second year, I received an internal innovation award and a performance bonus. For a while, I truly believed I had found the perfect company. Then everything changed. It started after a conference. Brightstone sent me to Seattle to participate in a cloud infrastructure summit. Originally, another senior engineer was supposed to attend, but he got sick 2 days before the event. Daniel asked if I could go instead. I spent an entire weekend preparing. The summit included engineers from Amazon, Microsoft, Stripe, and several well-known startups. I was terrified I would sound inexperienced compared to everyone else there. Instead, the panel went incredibly well. One of the discussions focused on scaling distributed systems under unpredictable healthcare traffic loads, which happened to be exactly what I had been working on for months. I explained how we handled failover patterns and asynchronous processing during peak traffic periods. People asked questions. A lot of questions. After the session ended, several engineers approached me to continue the conversation. One recruiter handed me a business card and said, "You're underpaid wherever you work." I laughed because I thought he was joking. When I got back to Chicago, Daniel called me into his office. I expected him to congratulate me. Instead, he closed the door and said, "I watched the recording from your panel." Something about his tone immediately felt wrong. "I thought it went well," I said carefully. "It did," he replied. Maybe a little too well. I frowned slightly. What does that mean? He leaned back in his chair. You talked about your accomplishments like they belonged entirely to you. I stared at him confused. I was explaining my technical contributions. You were representing Brightstone, he interrupted. Not yourself. I mentioned the team repeatedly. Not enough. There was a long silence. Then he added, You're very talented, Ethan. But people who start believing their own hype become difficult to manage. That sentence stayed with me for years. At the time I didn't fully understand it. Later I would. After that conference Daniel changed. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Projects I previously would have led were reassigned. I stopped being included in architecture planning meetings. When clients praised my work, Daniel redirected the credit toward department collaboration. If a project succeeded, it became a team accomplishment. If anything went wrong, even minor issues, it became my responsibility. A latency spike affecting less than 1% of requests was called careless engineering. A delayed rollout caused by another team's infrastructure became poor planning on Ethan's side. The rules kept changing. No matter how much I delivered, the target moved. First I blamed myself. I thought maybe I had become arrogant without realizing it. Maybe I talked too much during meetings. Maybe I pushed too hard technically. Maybe Daniel was trying to humble me for my own good. That's what toxic managers do best. They convince you that their mistreatment is mentorship. One night, after everyone else had left, I was sitting in the office debugging a deployment issue when my coworker Ryan walked over holding 2 coffees. He sat beside me quietly for a second. Then he said, He's doing the same thing to you now. I looked up. What? Daniel. Ryan lowered his voice. He always does this when someone gets recognition outside the company. I laughed nervously. You're imagining things. No, he said. I'm not. Then he told me about Olivia Chun. She had worked at Brightstone 3 years before I joined. According to Ryan, she had been brilliant. One of the best infrastructure engineers the company ever hired. She published technical articles online, got invited to conferences, started building a reputation in the industry. And Daniel slowly destroyed her confidence. He criticized everything she touched, excluded her from important projects, told leadership she was difficult. Eventually she quit and joined a major tech company in California. She's making probably 4 times what Brightstone paid her, Ryan said. Last I heard, she leads an engineering team of 40 people. I remember staring at my monitor after he left, because for the first time the pattern became visible. Daniel didn't mentor ambitious people. He controlled them. As long as your success strengthened his reputation, he supported you. The second your visibility became independent from him, you became a threat. And once he viewed you as a threat, the objective changed. He didn't need to fire you. He just needed to make you doubt yourself enough that eventually you left on your own. The real breaking point happened 8 months later. Brightstone landed a massive contract with a national pharmacy chain. The project involved rebuilding part of their supply distribution platform to process inventory updates in real time across hundreds of locations. It was the most technically challenging project I had ever worked on. I spent nearly 4 months designing the architecture. Late nights, weekends, endless testing. By the end, the system processed over 40,000 updates per minute with almost zero synchronization delay. The client loved it. Their CTO specifically emailed Daniel praising the implementation. The next morning Daniel called me into his office. My technical documentation sat on his desk covered in red comments. This architecture is over-engineered, he said flatly. I blinked. What? It's unnecessarily complex. It scales correctly, I replied carefully. We tested every major failure scenario. That's not the point. He flipped through the pages aggressively. You built this like you were trying to impress conference audiences instead of solving business problems. I could feel heat building in my chest. The client approved the design weeks ago. And now I'm telling you to redesign it. I stared at him. From scratch. Yes. That would take months. You have 3 weeks. I genuinely thought I misheard him. 3 weeks isn't realistic. He looked at me with complete indifference. Then maybe you're not as capable as everyone seems to think. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because I believed him, because part of me still needed him not to. I went home that night completely exhausted. My girlfriend Emma took one look at me and asked, "What happened?" I sat on the kitchen floor and explained everything. When I finished, she said quietly, "You know this isn't normal, right?" I remember laughing bitterly. Maybe I'm just not good enough. Emma looked genuinely angry. You rebuilt half their infrastructure over the last 2 years. Doesn't matter. It does matter. I shook my head. You don't understand corporate politics. No, she said. I understand emotional manipulation. That night I barely slept. But the next morning, I went back to the office and started rebuilding the system anyway. Because at that point I still believed that if I worked hard enough, eventually Daniel would respect me again. And that was the biggest mistake I made during my entire time at Brightstone. For the next 3 weeks, my life became work and almost nothing else. I arrived at the office before sunrise and left long after midnight. Most nights the cleaning staff saw me more often than my own friends did. I rebuilt the entire architecture exactly the way Daniel wanted, even though deep down I knew the original design had been solid. I simplified services that didn't need simplification. Removed redundancies that protected system stability, changed patterns that had worked perfectly well because Daniel insisted they were too academic. At one point, Ryan looked over my shoulder and quietly asked, "Why are you rewriting this? The first version was better." I stared at the screen for a second before answering, "Because I'm tired." That was the truth. Not physically, mentally. Constantly defending myself had become exhausting. Every conversation with Daniel felt like a performance review where the rules were invisible and failure was predetermined. By the final week, I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. Emma stopped trying to convince me to slow down because every conversation ended in an argument. "You're killing yourself for people who don't appreciate you," she said one night. "You don't get it," I snapped. Immediately I regretted it. But stress had turned me into someone I barely recognized. When the redesign was finally complete, I submitted the documentation and deployment metrics to Daniel on a Thursday morning. He reviewed everything for nearly 3 days. Monday afternoon, he called me into his office. "This version is acceptable," he said. That was it. No acknowledgement. No appreciation. No recognition that I had rebuilt months of work under impossible conditions. Just acceptable. Then he added, "You'll attend the client presentation Wednesday, but let me handle most of the communication." I should have known exactly what that meant. The meeting took place downtown at the client's headquarters. Their executive engineering team was there, along with several operations directors and the CTO, a man named Victor Hale. Daniel opened the presentation confidently, speaking as though the entire redesign had been his personal achievement. Our architecture decisions focused on scalability and long-term operational efficiency, he said smoothly. Every time he used the word our, I felt irritation rising in my chest. Not because I needed credit, because he was actively erasing me while I sat 3 feet away. About 20 minutes into the meeting, Victor interrupted him. "Sorry," he said politely. "I'd actually like to hear directly from the engineer who designed the processing layer." Daniel hesitated for half a second. Then he forced a smile and gestured toward me. "That would be Ethan." Victor turned toward me immediately. "Can you explain how you handled synchronization conflicts across regional inventory clusters?" The question was specific, deeply technical, exactly the kind of conversation I loved. So I answered. I walked through the architecture decisions carefully, explained the trade-offs, discussed recovery strategies during node failures, and described how we reduce duplicate event processing under traffic spikes. Victor listened closely the entire time. By the end, several people in the room were taking notes. One operations director even said, "That's honestly one of the cleanest approaches I've seen for this type of scaling issue." For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Competent, confident, useful. Then we got back into the elevator. Daniel didn't speak until the doors closed. "You embarrassed me in there." I stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me. You made the presentation unnecessarily technical." The CTO literally asked me technical questions. "You talk too much." I laughed quietly because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. You need to understand your role, he continued coldly. Clients trust leadership, not individual contributors trying to show off. That sentence changed something inside me permanently, because suddenly I understood. Nothing would ever be enough. Not better performance. Not loyalty. Not harder work. Daniel didn't want excellence from me. He wanted obedience. And the more valuable I became externally, the more aggressively he needed to minimize me internally. After that meeting, I stopped trying to win his approval. Emotionally, something shut off. I still worked hard. Still delivered results. Still acted professionally. But the belief that eventually things would improve disappeared completely. That was around the same time the recruiter contacted me. Her name was Claire Whitmore. At first I ignored the LinkedIn message. Most recruiter messages were generic copy-paste nonsense. But this one was different. She specifically referenced a distributed systems article I had published months earlier. She mentioned technical details from my conference panel in Seattle. And she wrote something that immediately caught my attention. Your experience suggests you're significantly underleveled in your current role. I reread that sentence 3 times. Underleveled. Nobody at Brightstone had used language like that about me in years. We scheduled a call for Friday afternoon. I almost canceled twice beforehand. Part of me still believed leaving Brightstone would mean failure. Another part was terrified the recruiter would realize I wasn't actually as talented as she thought. But when Claire called, the conversation felt completely different from anything I was used to. She wasn't trying to sell me fantasy. She spoke in specifics. She knew my projects, knew the systems I had worked on, knew my technical strengths better than some executives inside my own company. I think you've been operating at senior leadership level for a while, she said. You just haven't been given the title. I laughed awkwardly. I'm not leadership material. Why do you believe that? I opened my mouth to answer and stopped, because for a second I almost said, because my manager told me so. And hearing that in my own head suddenly sounded pathetic. Claire continued. The company I'm recruiting for needs someone who can scale engineering infrastructure during hypergrowth. Your background matches almost perfectly. What company? Ether Dynamics. I actually recognized the name immediately. Ether was one of the fastest-growing cloud infrastructure startups in the country. They had recently raised hundreds of millions in funding and were expanding aggressively. What role? Director of Platform Engineering. I nearly laughed. That's way above my level. No, Claire said calmly. It's above your current title. That distinction stayed with me. For the first time in years, someone looked at my experience and saw capability instead of limitation. Over the next several weeks, I interviewed with Ether. The process was intense. Technical architecture reviews, leadership evaluations, scaling scenarios, board interviews. At every stage, I expected them to realize they had made a mistake. Instead, the opposite happened. The deeper the conversations became, the more seriously they treated me. One interview lasted almost 4 hours because we became completely absorbed discussing distributed recovery systems and deployment pipelines. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody mocked my ideas. Nobody treated confidence like arrogance. One evening after a final interview round, Emma asked nervously, "How do you think it went?" I sat on the couch quietly for a second. Then I admitted something I hadn't said out loud before. I think I'm actually good at this." She smiled immediately. "I've been waiting years for you to realize that." The official offer came 2 weeks later. I was sitting in my car outside the Brightstone parking garage when Claire called. "Congratulations," she said. "They want you." I leaned back against the seat silently. Then she told me the numbers. 310,000 base salary, performance bonus, equity package, signing bonus, full executive benefits. I genuinely thought there had been a mistake. At Brightstone, I was making just under $105,000 after nearly 6 years. The jump felt unreal. "I don't understand," I said honestly. "Why would they offer me this much?" Claire answered immediately. "Because that's what the market says your skill set is worth." I sat there for a long time after the call ended, looking at the Brightstone building through the windshield. And for the first time I realized something painful. The biggest damage Daniel had done wasn't overwork or criticism. It was convincing me to underestimate myself. That night, Emma and I opened a bottle of wine and read through the contract together. "You're actually going to do this," she said softly. "I think so. You sound scared." "I am scared." "Good." I laughed. "Good." "Yeah," she said. "It means your life is finally changing." I signed the contract at 11:12 p.m. Claire emailed back 12 minutes later. "Welcome to Ether Dynamics." I barely slept that night. Not because I regretted it. Because deep down, I knew something enormous had just shifted. And I had no idea how Daniel Mercer was going to react when he found out. The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, Brightstone held its quarterly engineering review meeting. Mandatory attendance for the entire department. About 30 people sat in the conference room while Daniel presented slides about revenue growth, project timelines, and departmental performance. I remember almost none of it, because my signed offer letter was sitting in my inbox the entire time. Then Daniel reached the individual performance section. First, everything felt normal. A few engineers received praise. Some project milestones were discussed. Then my name appeared on the screen, and immediately I noticed the tone in his voice change. "Ethan Cole," he said slowly. "Strong technical ability, but inconsistent collaboration performance." My stomach tightened. Several coworkers shifted uncomfortably. Daniel clicked to the next slide showing a list of my projects. While Ethan has contributed to several major initiatives, there continue to be concerns regarding communication style, ownership boundaries, and overcomplication of technical solutions. The room was completely silent now. I could feel people avoiding eye contact. Daniel continued calmly, almost casually. "There's also been ongoing concern regarding self-promotion and prioritizing personal visibility over team alignment." I felt heat rising into my face. He was doing this publicly, on purpose. Again. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Frankly," Daniel said, "you should be grateful we even keep you here. Most companies wouldn't touch someone with your level of performance." For 1 second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And at that exact moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A calendar reminder. Ether Dynamics, onboarding paperwork completed. I looked down at the notification, then back at Daniel, and suddenly all the fear disappeared. Not reduced. Gone. Because I finally understood something. A man who needed to humiliate employees publicly to feel powerful was not someone whose opinion should define my life. So I smiled. And that smile confused him immediately. "You're right," I said calmly. "I actually am very lucky." Daniel's expression changed instantly. First he looked confused, then irritated, then genuinely unsettled. "What did you say?" he asked. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "I said you're right," I repeated. "I'm very lucky." The room stayed silent. I could hear someone shifting nervously near the back wall. Daniel crossed his arms. "I'm glad you're finally being realistic about your situation." I almost laughed. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and placed it carefully on the table. "I'm lucky," I said evenly, "because 3 days ago I accepted an offer from Ether Dynamics." The silence somehow became even heavier. Daniel blinked. "What?" "I'll be joining as Director of Platform Engineering next month." Nobody moved. Then I continued. "Base salary is $310,000. Equity package is worth roughly $1.8 million over 4 years." I signed the contract Monday night. Ryan literally whispered, "Holy shit." Several people turned toward me immediately. Daniel looked like all the blood had drained from his face. "That's not funny," he said sharply. "I'm not joking. You're leaving." "Yes." I kept my voice calm. "Actually, I was planning to submit my notice this afternoon. But since we're discussing my future publicly already, now seems as good a time as any." Daniel stared at me in complete disbelief. For years he had controlled every conversation in that room, every performance review, every promotion discussion, every perception. And suddenly, for the first time, he had lost control of the narrative. "You accepted another job without discussing it with leadership?" he asked. The question was so absurd I almost smiled. "You told me nobody else would hire me." A few people lowered their heads, trying not to react. Daniel's jaw tightened immediately. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. His voice hardened. You're being emotional. No, I said quietly. Actually, I think this is the calmest I've been in years. That sentence hit harder than anything else I could have said. Because it was true. I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. I was exhausted. Exhausted from spending years trying to earn approval from someone who had already decided I would never deserve it. Daniel looked around the room quickly, realizing everyone was watching him now instead of me. You're making an impulsive mistake, he said. Startups promise people unrealistic compensation packages all the time. Ether isn't a startup operating out of someone's garage, I replied calmly. They're valued at over $4 billion. That valuation can disappear overnight. Maybe. I shrugged slightly. But at least they think I'm capable. The room went completely still again. Daniel's face darkened instantly. You think they know you better than I do? That question would have crushed me a year earlier. Now it only made me sad. No, I answered honestly. I think they judged me based on my work instead of their insecurity. Ryan looked down immediately to hide his reaction. Daniel stepped toward me. You're seriously going to throw away 6 years here because your ego got bruised? I stood slowly. No, I said. I'm leaving because for 6 years I kept confusing disrespect with opportunity. Nobody spoke. Then I picked up my laptop. I'll send HR my formal resignation after this meeting. And before Daniel could respond, I walked out. My hands were shaking slightly once I reached the hallway. Not from fear. Adrenaline. Years of swallowed frustration were finally leaving my body all at once. I sat down at my desk and typed my resignation email carefully. Professional. Polite. Brief. No emotional language. No accusations. No revenge. Just facts. I thanked the company for the opportunities, confirmed my final working date, and stated I would fully document all active systems before transitioning out. Then I pressed send. 10 minutes later, HR called me. The representative, Melissa Grant, sounded genuinely stunned. Ethan, is this serious? Yes. We had no idea you were considering leaving. I almost laughed at that. Of course they didn't. Companies often confuse silence with loyalty. I've accepted another offer. There was a pause. Would you be willing to discuss retention options? No. Another pause. Can I ask where you're going? Ether Dynamics. Silence. Then, director level? Yes. Her tone changed immediately. Well, congratulations. That's a major opportunity. Thank you. We'd still appreciate an exit interview before your final day. That's fine. An hour later, the CEO called me personally. Martin Hale rarely interacted directly with engineers, unless something important was happening. Ethan, he said carefully, Daniel told me there was some conflict during the review meeting. I stared at my monitor for a second. Conflict isn't the word I'd use. What would you call it? Public humiliation. He exhaled quietly. Daniel says he was giving constructive feedback. I almost lost my composure right there. Constructive feedback. That corporate phrase people use to excuse cruelty. Constructive feedback doesn't involve telling employees nobody else would hire them. Martin went silent. Finally, he said, I understand emotions were high. No, I replied calmly. That's exactly the problem. Mine weren't. His were. Another silence. Then Martin asked the question I knew was coming. What would it take to keep you? For years, I had fantasized about this conversation. Imagine demanding promotions, raises, recognition, apologies. But now that it was happening, I felt strangely detached. Nothing, I answered honestly. You haven't even heard a counteroffer. It's not about money. That's easy to say when another company triples your compensation. I smiled slightly. That's exactly why it's not about money. Martin didn't respond, so I continued. For years, Daniel systematically undermined me because he viewed me as a threat instead of an employee. Everyone saw it. Nobody addressed it. I stayed because I kept believing performance would eventually matter more than politics. And now I understand that environments like this don't improve unless leadership forces them to. The conversation ended politely, but nothing changed. And honestly, by then I no longer cared. Over the next 2 weeks, something interesting happened inside the engineering department. People started talking openly, quietly at first, then constantly. Coworkers stopped by my desk asking questions about Ether, about salaries, about recruiters, about interview processes. One junior engineer named Marcus admitted he hadn't updated his resume in 4 years because he assumed no better opportunities existed. Another developer privately told me he had panic attacks before one-on-one meetings with Daniel. Ryan confessed he had already interviewed elsewhere twice but backed out both times because he doubted himself. That was the most disturbing part. Not the overwork. Not the politics. The self-doubt. Daniel had built an environment where talented people genuinely believed they were less capable than they actually were. Because insecure leaders survive by shrinking everyone around them. One evening Emma asked me, "Do you realize how different you sound now?" We were sitting on the balcony outside our apartment while Chicago traffic moved below us in long streams of light. "What do you mean?" "You're relaxed." I thought about that. She was right. For years my default emotional state had been tension. Every email notification created anxiety. Every meeting felt dangerous. Every interaction with Daniel required psychological preparation. And suddenly all of that was disappearing. Not because my life became easier. Because for the first time in years I stopped needing approval from someone who enjoyed withholding it. My second to last day at Brightstone, HR conducted my exit interview. Melissa sat across from me holding a printed evaluation form. Most of the questions were generic. Workplace satisfaction, compensation, benefits, management. Then she asked, "Would you consider returning to Brightstone in the future?" I answered honestly, "Not while Daniel Mercer is managing engineering." She hesitated slightly. "You're not the first person to say that." That surprised me less than it should have. Before leaving, she asked one final question. "Off the record, was the public criticism during the review meeting accurate?" I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said quietly, "I think Daniel needed me to believe it was." On my final day, I packed 6 years of my life into one cardboard box. A keyboard, few notebooks, photos, conference badges, coffee mugs. That was all. Ryan helped carry the box downstairs. Before I left, he asked quietly, "Were you scared? Terrified? Then how did you still do it?" I thought about that carefully. Because eventually being afraid of staying became worse than being afraid of leaving. He nodded slowly like he would remember that sentence later. Then he surprised me by pulling me into a quick hug. "Good luck, man." "You too." Daniel never said goodbye. I never saw him that final day. Part of me expected some dramatic confrontation. An apology. Another insult. Something. Instead, nothing happened. Which somehow felt fitting. For years he had occupied enormous space in my mind. And now he was already becoming irrelevant. That weekend before starting at Ether, I barely slept. Not because I regretted leaving. Because I was terrified I wouldn't be good enough. Ether operated at an entirely different level from Brightstone. Their systems handled massive global traffic loads. Their engineering standards were intense. These were people from elite companies. People with extraordinary backgrounds. What if Daniel had been right about me all along? What if I had simply fooled everyone during interviews? Sunday night, Emma found me rereading onboarding documents at the kitchen table. "You're spiraling again," she said gently. "I can't walk into this place and fail." "You won't. You don't know that." She sat beside me quietly. Then she asked, "Do you know what's sad?" "What?" "You still hear his voice every time you doubt yourself." That sentence hit me harder than anything else. Because she was right. Even after resigning, even after proving myself externally, part of Daniel still existed inside my head. That was the real damage. Not career delay. Psychological conditioning. The next morning, I arrived at Ether Dynamics 20 minutes early. The headquarters occupied several floors inside a massive glass building downtown. The lobby alone looked more modern than Brightstone's entire office. I stood outside for a second staring up at the building. Heart racing. Hands cold. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Emma. "You already earned your seat at the table. Stop asking permission to exist there." I read it twice. Then I walked inside. And within 10 minutes I realized something shocking. Nobody there treated me like I needed to prove I deserved oxygen. Connor Hayes, the CTO at Ether, met me in the lobby personally. Not an assistant. Not HR him. He shook my hand, smiled and said, "Glad you're here. We've been excited about this hire." That single sentence felt strange after years at Brightstone. Excited about this hire. Not skeptical. Not guarded. Not threatened. Excited. The engineering floor looked nothing like the environment I had left behind. People were focused, intense, clearly working hard, but nobody looked afraid. That difference mattered more than I expected. Fear changes the atmosphere of a workplace in ways most executives never notice. You hear it in silence during meetings. You see it in hesitation before asking questions. You feel it every time someone carefully phrases an opinion to avoid triggering the wrong person. At Ether, engineers argued openly about technical ideas. And nobody treated disagreement like disrespect. Connor introduced me to the platform engineering team. 32 engineers. Several principal architects. Infrastructure specialists. Distributed systems experts. People whose resumes honestly intimidated me. Then Connor said something in front of everyone that I still remember years later. "Ethan's here because we trust his judgment. If he challenges your ideas, engage with him. If you challenge his ideas, he'll engage with you. We care about good decisions, not ego." That sentence alone told me more about Ether's culture than any onboarding packet ever could. My first few weeks were overwhelming. The systems were massive. The scaling challenges were real. There were moments I felt completely out of my depth. But every time I admitted uncertainty, nobody weaponized it against me. Instead, people collaborated. One senior architect spent nearly 2 hours helping me understand part of their deployment orchestration because, in his words, "It took me 6 months to fully understand this too." At Brightstone, admitting confusion felt dangerous. At Ether it felt normal. Healthy. One evening after work, Connor and I stayed late reviewing infrastructure growth projections. At some point he asked casually, "How are you settling in?" I hesitated before answering honestly. "I keep waiting for someone to realize they overestimated me." Connor laughed immediately. "Imposter syndrome?" "Something like that." He leaned back in his chair. "Ethan, do you know why we hired you?" I shrugged slightly. "Because I interviewed well?" "No," he said. "Because every technical conversation with you demonstrated judgment. Anyone can memorize architecture patterns. Very few people understand trade-offs under pressure." That sentence stayed with me for a long time. Because Daniel had spent years treating confidence like arrogance and caution like weakness. At Ether, thoughtful decision-making was considered leadership. 3 months into the role, everything started accelerating. We reorganized the deployment pipeline, redesigned incident escalation procedures, reduced infrastructure recovery times significantly. Hiring expanded aggressively. Suddenly I was leading multiple teams simultaneously. And for the first time in my career, I realized I genuinely loved leadership when it wasn't built around fear. Helping engineers grow felt better than writing code ever had. One junior developer reminded me painfully of myself years earlier. Brilliant. Anxious. Constantly apologizing for asking questions. After one architecture review, she quietly said, "Sorry if my suggestions were stupid." And without even thinking, I answered immediately. Good engineering teams don't punish people for thinking out loud. The moment the words left my mouth, I realized I was speaking to my younger self as much as her. Around 6 months after joining Ether, Ryan messaged me unexpectedly. Things at Brightstone were collapsing. 3 more senior engineers had resigned. Several major infrastructure deadlines were behind schedule. One client had apparently escalated complaints directly to executive leadership after repeated deployment failures. Then Ryan wrote something that made me stare at my screen for several seconds. "People are finally talking openly about Daniel." I asked what he meant. Ryan explained that after enough engineers left, leadership could no longer ignore the pattern. Exit interviews repeatedly mentioned the same issues: public humiliation, micromanagement, credit stealing, psychological intimidation, engineers constantly feeling afraid to speak honestly. Apparently Martin Hale had finally launched an internal investigation into management culture within the engineering department. And suddenly stories people had kept quiet about for years started surfacing everywhere. Not just mine. Dozens of them. I wish I could say hearing that made me happy. Honestly, it mostly made me tired. Because none of it was new. Leadership simply ignored the problem until losing talent became expensive. A few weeks later, Ryan interviewed at Ether. I recommended him personally. He got the job almost immediately. On his second week, we grabbed coffee together downstairs. "This place feels fake sometimes," he admitted. "What do you mean?" "Nobody's trying to undermine each other." I laughed. "Yeah, that takes time to get used to." Then he said something quietly. "You know Daniel really messed with everyone's heads, right?" I looked at him carefully. Ryan stared down into his coffee. "I honestly thought I was mediocre for years." That hit me hard because I understood exactly what he meant. Toxic managers rarely destroy confidence all at once. They do it slowly. Small comments. Constant criticism. Backhanded compliments. Subtle humiliation. Over time you stop trusting your own abilities. And once someone controls your self-perception, they control almost everything else too. About 9 months after I left Brightstone, I received an email from Martin Hale. Subject line: personal apology. I opened it cautiously. The message was long. More honest than I expected. Martin admitted leadership had failed to recognize the severity of Daniel's behavior for years. Multiple employees confirmed patterns of intimidation, favoritism, and deliberate undermining. The company had terminated Daniel 2 weeks earlier. Martin wrote, "You were right about far more than we realized at the time. I'm sorry we allowed that environment to continue." I sat staring at the email for several minutes. Emma read it later that night and asked, "How does it feel?" I thought about it carefully. Strangely empty. And it did. Because vindication sounds emotionally satisfying in theory. But by the time it arrives, you've often already outgrown the people who hurt you. Daniel getting fired didn't heal anything. It simply confirmed that I had never been the problem. About a year later, Ether announced plans to go public. By then the company had exploded in size. Hundreds of engineers. Global expansion. Massive enterprise contracts. The equity package I almost didn't believe during negotiations had multiplied in value several times over. Financially, my entire life changed. But strangely, the money mattered less than I once imagined. The real transformation was internal. I no longer walked into rooms assuming I needed permission to belong there. I stopped apologizing before speaking. Stopped shrinking myself to protect insecure people. Stopped confusing anxiety with humility. That was the real success. Not the salary. Not the title. Not the stock options. Freedom. 2 years after leaving Brightstone, I attended another cloud infrastructure conference in San Francisco. This time I was one of the keynote speakers. Several hundred engineers attended the session. Afterward, while people gathered near the networking area, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Ethan." I turned around. Daniel Mercer looked older. More tired. Less certain. For a second neither of us spoke. Then he nodded awkwardly. "I saw your talk," he said. "You did well." "Thank you." Another silence. Finally he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." A younger version of me had imagined this moment countless times. I thought it would feel victorious. Instead it just felt sad. "I treated you unfairly," Daniel admitted. "I was threatened by you." Hearing him say it out loud was surreal. For years I questioned my own reality. And now here he was confirming all of it directly. "I spent a long time convincing myself I was protecting standards," he continued. "But honestly, I think I was scared of being replaced." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered honestly, "You didn't just hurt my career back then. You changed the way I saw myself." His expression dropped immediately. "I know." "No," I said quietly. "I don't think you do." For a second he looked like he wanted to say something else. Instead he just nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." And strangely enough I believed he meant it. But some damage arrives too late for apologies to matter. I shook his hand politely and walked away. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just finished. 3 years after that quarterly review meeting, Ether Dynamics went public at a valuation larger than anyone originally predicted. The stock payout changed my life permanently. Emma and I bought a house near the water. We got married that fall. Ryan became one of the strongest engineering managers in the company. Several former Brightstone employees eventually joined Ether or other major firms, and thrived once they escaped that environment. And sometimes late at night I still think about that conference room. The silence. Daniel's voice. The certainty with which he told me nobody else would hire me. What scares me now isn't that he said it. What scares me is how close I came to believing him forever. Because that's the real danger of toxic people in positions of authority. Not that they underestimate you. That eventually you start doing it too. If Claire Whitmore had never sent that message, if I had ignored it, fear had won. I might still be sitting in that same office trying to earn approval from someone who needed me insecure to feel important. Instead, I left. And the moment I left, my entire life changed. That was the lesson I carried with me afterward. Sometimes the hardest part of success is realizing you were never the problem to begin with.